Okay, the last part of this tape, I want to cover two things in great detail, because they're religious practices that were very common in the ancient world, and in fact you can't possibly understand the biblical text of the Old Testament without understanding these practices, and yet both of these practices appear very strange to us. So I want to talk about each of them in turn in detail so we can understand them, and I have something to refer to and grab onto when these practices arise in the various biblical stories and narratives that we're going to read. The first of the practices is animal sacrifice. Central to the Israelite worship system is the ritual slaughter of animals. I always like to think when I go to church, and in my particular church, Roman Catholic Church, there's an altar. And it's on the altar that the priest consecrates the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, the body and the blood of Christ. And the word altar comes from this sacrificial system. By the way, spell it with an A, not an E. To alter something, E is to change it. An altar is a ritual place for sacrifice. Some Protestant churches also have an altar, either for the Eucharist, or in some Protestant churches the altar is the place where people kneel and pray. But in each case we're going back to this notion of sacrifice. But it's such a different feel. When I go into my church, which is where I started this little exposition, the altar is very clean, and the church is very relatively quiet. Maybe some kids are crying. But if you went to the place of worship in ancient Israel, it would be a noisy and a smelly place, because everybody was bringing in livestock. They brought in, or they bought, animals to kill. And those animals that were killed were regarded as a sacrifice for Yahweh. Obvious question. Why did they kill animals? For what purpose was the killing of animals that became an absolutely essential part of the Israelite worship? And I've laid out like maybe 6 or 7 different reasons for the sacrifice. Some of these reasons can work in conjunction, others work by themselves, but one or more of these reasons is in operation every time you see a sacrifice in the ancient world. The most obvious and basic meaning of a sacrifice is as food for the god. Notice I'm speaking generally here. I'm not focused particularly in on Israel, because this is a general practice throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. The idea was that the universe was inhabited by many supernatural beings, referred to as gods, and these gods were more powerful than human beings, but they had physical needs just like human beings did, and one of the things they had to do was eat. And the only way they can get food was if worshippers would offer the food to them. Now, there were 2 places that gods could inhabit. One, because those are the places that humans couldn't go to and so didn't see them. One place was in the sky. There were sky gods, and Yahweh was in fact a sky god. And then there were earth gods. There were gods who lived under the earth. So all of these gods have to eat. How do you feed them? Well, in order to feed a sky god, I mean, if you take a big hunk of steak and you throw it up into the sky, it's going to fall back down in your face. So what did they do? They burned it, because they noticed that after they burned something, let's say in this case a piece of meat, that what was left was ash, and it was very light and relatively didn't have the heft or the moisture or anything of the original steak. And they saw that smoke rose up into the sky, and the Hebrew word for sky and heaven is the same word. So the smoke rose up in the sky, and what was left was what was inedible, so obviously what was edible went up into the sky, and the god had it. If you were dealing with an earth god, you buried it. And we see evidence of both within the Hebrew Bible, but Yahweh is a sky god. And so all of Yahweh's sacrifices were burned. So the most obvious reason is for food for the god. Now, the Israelites, this is kind of a leftover. They didn't really believe that Yahweh actually ate the sacrifice through most of the Hebrew Bible. We see a little bit of evidence that one of the places is in the flood. At the very end of the flood, Noah offers a sacrifice to Yahweh in gratefulness for his survival. And it says that the smell of it rose up as a sweet-smelling savor to the Lord, to Yahweh. And that's kind of an indication that the burning of the food actually gave Yahweh a physical pleasure, a sweet savor. But for the most part, we don't see references to Yahweh actually, physically, needing the nourishment from the sacrifice. It really goes into different directions in Israel. A good example of where we see this in another ancient Near Eastern literature is in a parallel flood story that comes out of Babylon. The story is called Gilgamesh. And at the end of the Gilgamesh story, when the Noah figure, who's known as Utnapishtim in the Babylonian story, offers a sacrifice, the gods, and of course there are many gods because the Babylonians were a polytheistic group, the gods hover over the sacrifice like flies. They're so hungry. So that's the most basic definition of sacrifice. But there are many others. One is a communal meal. This was a way for a worshiper to commune, to have fellowship, to keep company with a divine being, a god. You would bring an animal, you would slaughter it, you would butcher it, you would cook part of it, and you would burn part of it. The part that was burned, and that's very carefully specified which part it is, it's usually some of the best parts, the part that's burned would be Yahweh's part, or the God's part, and the part that was cooked would be eaten by the worshiper and the worshiper's family, and that would be the worshiper's part. And the idea was that everybody's sharing a meal together, the God and the worshippers. This carries over very strongly into many Christian ideas about the Eucharist. Some other possibilities. We have, let's see, food for the God, communal meal, and then we have atonement. This is the notion that when an individual sins, there's a punishment. And the punishment for many sins in ancient Israel in the legal code is death. But you can't kill people for like little minor piddly things, so there's a provision made for that. Instead of the sinner dying, the animal dies. So there's an exchange, there's a transference that takes place. The worshiper gives the sin to the animal, and then the animal bears the punishment instead of the worshiper. And this comes into Christian thinking in many ways, most obviously when the Christ is called the Lamb of God. Or when John the Baptist sees Jesus and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Or in basic Christian teaching, that when Jesus died on the cross, he died as a sacrificial animal to bear the sins of the whole world in his own body so that we would not have to be punished for the sins if we trust in Jesus. This is where it comes into the New Testament. Although, because Jesus died then, the sacrifice is no longer bloody. No one actually has to get killed again. No living thing has to get killed any longer. I've lumped a few of them together here. I got one more, and it's really obvious when you think about it, but nobody ever thinks about it when I open this up to a class and I say, how many different reasons can you think for the sacrifice? And this is food for priests. The people who work as priests are not producing food. They are not raising livestock. They are not growing any agricultural products. So if they're going to eat, there has to be some way for them to eat. I suppose a king could just provide for them out of his own resources, but this is the provision. Part of every animal that's offered for sacrifice, with very few exceptions, is in fact taken over and eaten by the priests for their nourishment, and also by the priest's family. And that might seem a little bit, I don't know, selfish, or using this sacred stuff in a profane manner, but in fact, the priests have to eat too, and this is the provision that's made. So this is how I want you to understand sacrifice. And we're going to see various sacrifices being performed, and we'll try to kind of understand how they're functioning in the context, because they're functioning in a lot of ways. One of the very common mistakes in Christian teaching about Jewish and Hebrew sacrifice is to just say everything is atonement, because the atonement looms so large in Christian theology. But in fact, it spreads about equally between 2 and 3 is probably the most important. 1 not very important, and 4 just really obvious but not significant the way some of the other things are as well, at least until we see some places where priests begin to abuse the privilege and they start taking and eating for themselves portions that were reserved for Yahweh. Or, even worse, they start extorting more from the worshipers for sacrifice than actually is required. And there's a number of cases for that as well.